All right, everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about marriage, and the charts we are looking at are going to be the charts of Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. This is a couple that were married, I think, for at least 50 years or something close to it. What I've discovered is even for persons with weak seventh houses, everyone still has Venus in their chart, and everyone is interested in love. It's just one of those key ingredients. So it is one of the topics you will be asked about perhaps most. And when we're looking at natal charts, there are basically there are three things we look for in terms of love. As we discussed last week, love affairs, romance, one's sexual habits or inclinations, experiences with dating are ruled by the fifth house. And one's experience with marriage, and although there are some astrologers that will disagree with this, but I do believe that long-term partnerships, even if not legally united, are seventh house as opposed to fifth house. Though I have had arguments with this with others, but the chart holds out. All you have to do is look at the seventh house and look at what's going on in their lives. So we look to the seventh house to determine our success with marriage and companionship. And we look to the fifth house to determine our success with love affairs. So each week we'll learn different specific applications when we're looking at charts. So let's talk about Joanne's chart and love affairs. We can see the planet in the house is considered the chief ruler. The planet ruling the sign on the cusp would be considered the co-ruler. What could we say about Jupiter in the fifth house?
It's her weakest planet, for one thing.
Yes, Jupiter is her weakest planet. Here we have some contradicting information. Normally, if we're looking at Jupiter, we read Jupiter as the planet of abundance. Jupiter brings opportunities. So normally, if you have Jupiter in your fifth house, then there is a very good chance you could have an abundance of love affairs in your lifetime.
I just wanted to say, with Jupiter there and it's squaring Venus, it may be that the individual could tend to be overly optimistic or grandiose.
That's a good description, Holly.
High expectations. And it reminds me of, I think it was Mae West saying something like, you can never have too much of a good thing.
That would be Jupiter in the fifth house. So in this case, normally Jupiter would bring abundance. But as Holly has pointed out, if we look to the aspects, Venus squared Jupiter. So Jupiter squares Venus and Neptune, but it's not a T-square, only because Venus is short of being in opposition to Neptune. If we look, that we have a T-square involving the Sun, Jupiter, and Neptune, but we don't have a T-square with Venus, Jupiter, and Neptune. Nevertheless, we do have a square from Venus to Jupiter. So the rulers of her fifth house are in conflict with one another. Does anyone know how this relationship started? As a clandestine romance. Paul Newman was married when they met.
The Venus and Pisces, can Pisces and Neptune sometimes rule things that go on behind the scenes?
They can. And so they met in 1953 while working on the Broadway production of Picnic. Their relationship began as an adulterous affair. 5 years later, in 1957, he divorced his wife, Jackie Witt. Newman married Joanne Woodward the following year on January 29, 1958. Remained married for 50 years until his death in 2008. So, if we're looking at love affairs, well, there's afflictions to the fifth house. Let's just look at the fifth house in general, because that can inform us. Here, moderate in strength, but if we look at it, it's the second most harmonious house in her chart. Why do you think that is? Even though Venus and Jupiter are square, they're both the benefics. So, Venus square Jupiter, that's the tiniest amount of discord between them. Nevertheless, they both bring a certain amount of harmony to the fifth house. So that's love affairs. Let's look at Newman's chart for love affairs. Gemini, unoccupied. We can see in terms of power, it's moderately powerful. And why is that?
Because Mercury's his dominant planet.
Yes, Gemini is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury in his chart is most powerful. Mercury forms a semi-square to the moon, a very powerful conjunction to Venus, conjunction to Jupiter, sextile to Saturn, sextile to Uranus, a very discordant opposition to Pluto, sextile to midheaven, and a conjunction to the ascendant, which is possibly the most powerful aspect in his chart. So, dominant Mercury, conjunct the ascendant. What could we say about Paul Newman? Communicator.
Yeah.
This is somebody who could express himself well. Now, even though the house is not that strong, with the ruler conjuncting the ascendant, what might we say about the role of love affairs or children in his life? That he might place them above other things in his realm of personal importance. Now, sadly, Mercury's also in an opposition with Pluto. Does anyone know what happened to his first child, Scott? Drug overdose. So we don't know if it was suicide, or one would imagine it was accidental. But
Oh my goodness, and seeing that Jupiter overdoing in the 12th house, which can be escapist and seeking, transcendence. Anyway, that just jumped out. The Jupiter there in the 12th conjunct the Mercury.
right. So, and we would say that with Mercury conjunct Jupiter, that experiences with children and love affairs are important and a positive influence. So we could determine.
Venus too, right? Mercury's also conjunct
Oh, yeah,
Venus.
seriously.
Yes, if we look, well, let's see. Yes, conjunct Venus as well. So, and with both, Mercury conjunct Venus, the ascendant, Jupiter, what about people being in love with him?
Lots.
Yeah,
I'm thinking.
yeah. Paul Newman was hot, and everyone was drawn to him. That's one reason he had so much success.
What was that cool reserve of his?
Right. All of this is in Capricorn.
Yeah.
But just talking about him, Sun in Aquarius, what is the best trait of Aquarius? Altruism or humanitarianism? And what is Newman known for?
Newman's Own.
Newman's Own. I'm sure all of you have at some point either eaten his version of Oreos or used salad dressing or Fig Newman's, for which I think he raised at one point over $100 million for charity. So a great example of Aquarius energy. So, and the Sun in Aquarius rules the 8th house of other people's money. But that's an aside, since that's really not what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about love affairs and marriage. Let's move on to marriage. He has Cancer on the cusp, Neptune in Leo in the 7th house, and the moon would then be the co-ruler. Chief ruler Neptune, co-ruler moon. Let's talk about Neptune in the 7th house.
Very idealistic.
One is idealistic about their mates. They tend to have certain fantasies or expectations of what marriage should really be like. They want to see rose petals falling from heaven and hear bells when their eyes meet from across the room. It's that type of expectation. Now, when we have really high expectations, what are one of the possible outcomes? Disappointment, which Neptune can bring. So I always say, whenever you have Neptune in the 7th house, you need to be a little careful. That's where you have to do your reality check, which is, are you seeing the others in your life clearly?
All right.
Now, Zane,
Question, Christopher.
yes.
The 7th house is also open enemies, correct?
Correct.
So how would Neptune play into that?
Well, Neptune rules actors, people involved in theater, and when it could represent one misjudging their enemies. Now, I don't know. I've not read anything about Paul Newman where he was greatly disliked. You've got to imagine with that first house, he was greatly liked or loved. But chances are there were other actors who were in competition with him that might have done, behind the scenes or underhanded things in competition for roles. What else? You could get in trouble with what? The drug cartel? With the Neptune in the 7th? As your open enemies? He also, one of his other foundations was the Scott Newman Foundation, which was geared towards drug education. So,
Did Joanne have any issues with drugs?
not that I know of, but she was somewhat of a mystic. And so one of the things Zane says, and I believe this is in Course 10.1, delineating the horoscope, he warns about having Neptune or Uranus in the 7th house, that things don't always turn out as expected. Oftentimes, if you have Neptune in your 7th house, midstream in a relationship, your mate can, become a mystic or a monk or nun.
Or revolutionary?
Or with Uranus, they're off with Che Guevara or joining, the Cultural Revolution in China. So things can change. So I don't know. I've not read anything about their relationship shifting, but Joanne did have a lot of interest in astrology and other mystical things. Neptune is illusions, and that can be film, it's motion picture, it's theater, it's the stage, it's makeup, it's costuming. Now, the moon falls in his 2nd house, The ruler of the 7th in the 2nd, partnerships can become subservient to finances. This can go either way, either expecting the spouse to be a breadwinner or being willing with the moon to be a caregiver and to also be able to take care of one's companion. Let's switch over.
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
When we were looking at Joanne's chart and she had those aspects of the second house from her 5th house, I think they were squares. Did she come from an old New England family?
I don't really know about her, but she's from Georgia, and so they did live there for much of their life. They sort of eschewed Hollywood and lived in Connecticut.
Christopher?
Yes.
Quick question. So I'm noticing that you are looking at the ruler of, I see Cancer there on the 7th, and that's what's taking you, and the co-ruler is the moon, and that takes you to the 2nd house?
Correct.
Right. And then do you then kind of put those two houses together in some way? Or
Well, yes. What you're doing is you're saying that 7th house, and this is the case in both charts. In Joanne's chart, Cancer. They both have Capricorn rising. So, Cancer, that means Cancer will be on the 7th. The moon becomes the co-ruler of the 7th house, and its position indicates a tie-in, you might call it, or Zane calls it subservience, that 7th house matters become subservient to 2nd house matters. In this case, let's go back. Ruler of the 7th in the 2nd. Ruler of the 7th in the 2nd. And I imagine they both had careers, but guess what? They worked together throughout their careers. I found 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 films that they worked on together. Here again, their incomes are united. They're working at the same time, which is kind of unusual in Hollywood, and we saw last week that proved to be a problem for Benjamin and Julia. In this case, these two had joint incomes. Their incomes impacted one another, and they were able to work simultaneously, which had to have been a plus. But let's switch over and look at, her 7th house with the moon. We've already discussed the influence of the moon. Let's discuss the influence of Pluto. Wherever Pluto falls in our chart, we are subject to...
Coercion or cooperation?
Correct. Now, who knows? It may have been coercion at first. You know, I got a divorce, you're going to marry me.
Right.
Or the other way around. You get a divorce so I can marry you. But cooperation was, clearly there. We can certainly see that through the number of films that they made together. I don't know what role she may have had in any of the philanthropic activities. Right, and in a sense they met in a group activity, working on a play together, and they shared friends. So that can help. Some relationships are held together through their mutual bond of socializing. Or when the passion, the romance, the sex wears off, you better hope that person's still fun to be around, that you can still play with them on some level in friendships. So, now what I want to look at is, let's go at least through the first step that we did last week, is let's look at dominant planets. I'm going to sort them by power. Joanne, dominant Mercury, ascendant Moon. Paul, dominant Mercury, ascendant Venus. Wait, wasn't Venus her fourth most powerful planet? No, Saturn. Sorry. So, what could we say about the two of them, with each of them having dominant Mercuries and dominant ascendants? They both have Mercury in the first house. They both have Capricorn rising.
They probably like to talk about similar things. They have a lot to talk about that's in common.
Yes. And again, Mercury is so key in relationships because you want someone you can talk to. And if there's a dominant Mercury person, generally they want someone else who will talk back to them. They don't want it to just be a soliloquy. They want a conversation, an exchange. So there could be shared interests, and of course their ascendants are only 2 degrees apart, 11 Capricorn and 13 Capricorn. So if we look at aspects, it's wide, it's not just 1 degree. But what we can say about ascendants is there's also a physical pull. There can be chemistry. The dolphin, it's the martyrdom decadent, which they both share. So we have that in common. Let's look at houses 1, 2, and 7 for Joanne. We have 1, 10, and 6 for Paul. What do they share? They both share the first house. And, Newman's Own was, although it was sold in supermarkets, it had sort of, a healthy quality to it, or at least the packaging made it look so. For Paul, with the first, 10th, and 6th, what's important to him? Appearance, his own personal interest, his career, and his employment. For Joanne, her health, appearance, physical body, her income, and her mate. Her relationships with others are important to her. So chances are, where they connected was over getting out and walking or riding horses But again, look, she has Saturn on the ascendant. So chances are her safety urges are somewhat pronounced. I don't think she'd have an affinity for race car driving, and my guess is she probably preferred that he didn't. All right, and then let's look at signs. Aquarius, Capricorn, Pisces for Joanne. Capricorn, Scorpio, Gemini. Nevertheless, these are compatible signs. Gemini, if you remember, is compatible with Aquarius. Scorpio is compatible with Pisces and with Capricorn. So earth and water are compatible, and air signs are compatible. So in a sense, their signs are compatible, and it might be interesting since temperament is important. If we're looking at elements, dominant element for Paul Newman is earth, followed by water. For Joanne, dominant element is air, followed by earth. So, where did they connect? Through earth.
Practical matters.
Yeah, they connected on practical matters. Saturn's in Capricorn on the ascendant. Right, now, if you've noticed on these charts, I have progressions outlined. And I've outlined progressions for January 29th, 1958.
Is that when they married?
Yes. When marrying, does anyone have ideas of what we want to look for in a chart when getting married?
maybe a trine between Saturn and Venus, or something coming to the seventh house, like something, maybe Jupiter or maybe Saturn, something between Saturn, which gives permanence, and Venus in kind of love.
But what we're looking for are aspects to the ruler or rulers of the seventh house, and if that, and preferably harmonious aspects. If you marry under adverse aspects to the seventh house, relationships, marriages do not always last. Now, Venus is also, in the case that there are no aspects to the seventh house, if you are advising someone to marry, and you're looking forward in their chart, they're saying, oh, when should I marry? Or when will I get married? If there are no seventh house aspects, you want to look for favorable progressions involving Venus. Now, I know you like Saturn in this matter, Holly. However, Saturn is known as the major malefic. And to marry under Saturn aspects can usually indicate a very hard time. Now, in last week's class, I did mention that you want, between charts, if you have Saturn-Venus aspects, and they are favorable, then you have a greater chance than normal of a relationship lasting. Why is that? Saturn works like a tent peg. It holds things in place. It's the anchor, it's the foundation, it's the sense of duty.
You want to look for favorable aspects to the ruler of the seventh house. And the ruler of the seventh house is going to be the ruling planet on the cusp, or will that be a planet that's in the house?
The planet in the house is considered the ruler. If there are more than one planet in the house, the planet closest to the cusp is considered the ruler. Though I also say if there's more than one planet in the house, look at which one's stronger. There's certain information to be gained there. The planet governing the sign on the cusp becomes the co-ruler, with the exception if the house is unoccupied, and then the planet that rules the sign on the cusp is the ruler.
Thank you, thank you. So we would be looking to favorable aspects to Pluto.
Correct. Or,
Right, by progression or by transit?
well, by progression. Progressions, have a hefty amount of energy. Transits are fleeting, but you might, if you were, setting up a date, you might want to look at major progressions and to see if there are any transiting reinforcements at a time. So let's look. Oh, look, we have progressions here. All right. Yeah, when you change your name, your reputation changes. Look what she married under. She had Venus squaring Pluto. So that is what we would call an adverse.
That's an ouchie.
Yeah, that's she married under an adverse aspect. However, Venus was also sextile Mars at that time.
Venus with Pluto, kind of that hidden aspect of the Hades Pluto, kind of below the surface.
Right, in a sense.
In their part anyway, and then it kind of fits with them marrying, with him coming out of, they're starting as a hidden affair.
I think so. Why? In order for this marriage to take place, another marriage had to fail.
Venus is the most harmonious planet in Joanne's chart, actually.
Let's take a look.
0.58 harmonides.
Yes, it is. So, and this is a good point that Michael's making. One of the things I emphasize is we have to look at the conditioning in the natal chart to get an understanding of how that planet will express by progression. So what Michael has pointed out is we have her greatest harmony, even though it's involved in a square. What happens by progressions is the energy of the natal chart is more important than the nature of the aspect involved by progression. Because that natal planet is bringing its conditioning with it to the event. So even though we'd say she's marrying under an adverse aspect, we've now gone back and said, this is her best planet. It's the planet of love. And although it's a square, it is aspecting the ruler of her 7th house. Let's look at his chart. So any other 7th house aspects here? We look for aspects to Pluto, the moon, or Venus. And Vicky said aspects to the midheaven, which I don't see any at this time.
Are you saying the energy or conditioning of a planet in the natal chart trumps the
nature of the aspect.
Of progression
Mm-hmm.
or
No,
any
of
aspect
progression.
at all?
By progression. By progressions, we're just looking at weather conditions. Nevertheless, we could guess that there were some issues. Venus was squaring Pluto.
Right, and Venus rules the 10th house. So
Oh,
it's,
10th house
it is
ruler.
being-
Okay.
Yeah, it's being aspected.
The sun, because the sun represents, males, generic sex males in a woman's chart, there was a conjunction, was it, of Mars and the sun together, and I believe, aspects to the sun in a woman's chart and aspects to the moon in a man's chart indicates, it's indicative of progression. Mars, major progression, had come into a conjunction natal sun.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
The very
And that was significant at the time of marriage.
The very first thing we looked at last week, Laura, was the role of the sun and moon in anyone's chart, male or female, because it shows overall their relationships with men or women. So with Joanne, the sun is moderately powerful and close to neutral, mildly harmonious. With Paul, the sun is weak, the moon is weaker and discordant, and the sun's very discordant, so he didn't get along with anyone. Good thing he was a philanthropist. I love humanity. It's people I can't stand.
Do you think with the sun that disharmonious, he would have come across as full of himself or, terribly self-centered or the negative?
Yes, I would imagine that, unless he's somebody who had recognized that those were traits, or that he had mentors or parents or grandparents in his life that might have, shaped him in some ways.
It's hard to believe he wasn't a nice guy, just from his
First house.
charismatic, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, from the
Well,
first
Venus,
house,
Venus.
one is guessing that. From the overall harmony in the chart, one is guessing that. But I would imagine he did have an ego. And
I'd imagine it got inflated whether he liked it or not.
right, and he may have felt strongly about his own self-importance or his own self-image.
I bet he did.
His beer.
Oh,
He
his-
could drink like a 6-pack a day and then do 1,000,000 sit-ups because he was very vain about his stomach.
Okay, so he a 6-pack, and then he worked on his 6-pack.
Looking at his chart, yeah, Jupiter in the 12th, and the 12th to me there was something about the Holy Spirit, seeking the Holy Spirit versus the Spirit in alcohol, and Jupiter can do that, and then with Pluto in his 6th house, I don't know if you would consider that the physical body, but it could be routines designed, health and exercise routines designed to kind of transform the body. I don't know. But,
Well, the first house would certainly lend towards that.
yes.
Having a dominant first house and a strongly harmonious first house. So
Capricorn somebody in mastery and focus and dedication, I mean, that's a pretty disciplined thing to do that many sit-ups.
Right. The co-ruler of the first house is Saturn, which falls up here at the top of the chart, sextiling
It drains that
Mercury and Venus, and
So that's even added.
And it's trining.
discipline.
right, it trines Pluto. So as Vicky was pointing out, she says it's draining this opposition. We call it a conciliatory factor in astrology. When a planet, when two planets are in discordant aspect and a third planet harmoniously aspects both, his concerns about his reputation may have caused him to discipline himself physically to be able to maintain appearance. It's called a conciliatory factor when one planet breaks up a discordant aspect by in this case it makes a trine to Pluto and a sextile to Mercury and the ascendant
And that Jupiter.
and the Jupiter and to Venus, and these are all in opposition to one another. So it's a way where you can funnel the energy into something constructive, and when your attention is focused on that area, it's not being focused in on this discordant tug of war that would otherwise take place. But what I wanted to do was look at his aspects and what was present when he married.
That's also in the
Seventh house progressions would be aspects to Neptune or the moon. And again, we want to look for harmonious aspects to Venus. What we might guess from this, we can see the sun trining the midheaven at the time of his marriage. He didn't take on her last name, but this is a wedding that would have been in the papers. This is something that would have drawn attention. Mars trine Venus. What's going on at the time of his marriage? And it looks like leading up to this, 1955 to 58, that could be a hot and heavy affair. Mars trine Venus, Venus sextile Mars. Clearly he had an affair, which led to this marriage that lasted 50 years. My guess is in this relationship that there was probably a fidelity that took place. Although he doesn't have really strong seventh house aspect showing up, what he is having is Saturn sextile Venus. Relationship lasted. We have Jupiter conjunct Venus. You don't get happier than that. Venus conjunct the ascendant, progressed ascendant, being in love. Venus sextile Mars and Mars trine Venus. So again, we're not seeing seventh house aspects for him at the time of marriage, but there is a truckload of Venus aspects going on.
Was he in love with her, or was she in love with him?
I think it was mutual. I do think that this was very much mutual.
More magical for him. Judging by these aspects, he could have just been, in the seventh heaven. Especially with his romanticism, his Neptune in the seventh anyway.
Well, then let's... right, he has 7 planets in personal houses. And she has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 planets in personal houses. Now, how does that work on a relationship, though?
Well, they had their own lives.
Absolutely. They both had... She wasn't into race car driving,
Right.
and he wasn't into astrology and tarot cards.
Yeah, but with
They-
both sharing the same ascendant, they basically had a very similar world view.
Probably appreciate one another.
Right, what Sharon's saying about them, sharing a sense of importance in the same quadrants of life, I think is a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge of people with strong personal quadrants, though, is they tend to be self-absorbed. And self-absorbed people do have difficulty in relationships. But this was a case where it worked.
She did all kinds of charities on her own. I know she worked a lot with animals and shelter animals and
One of the steps that we do is we look at the placement of planets and their distribution in the other person's chart to see what the influence is. So if we were to look at Joanne's chart and start to place Paul's planets, we would see that his ascendant, Mercury, Venus, and Sun
would all fall in her.
all fall in her first house. So this, Sharon, is where that influence is being felt, primarily because of those signs. With those planets in her first house, there is a what? Physical attraction. Now, with his chart, we have her Mercury, her Mars, her Moon all fall in his first house. So again, this is something mutual. There was they liked each other's looks. Now, if we move on down here, with her second house, her Sun and Venus fall in his second house. And with her, his Moon and Uranus fall in her second house. So the other thing they share is the fact that their personal planets fall in one another's personal houses. In his 8th house, her Saturn and ascendant fall in his 12th house. So again, he could feel a psychic connection. There could be some intense, subconscious connection. And in her chart, his Jupiter falls in her 12th house. She could feel very protected by that. Her Saturn in his 12th house would have a little bit of a different effect.
The personal sector of his house.
The personal houses are
Speak to
12.
that.
Yes, personal houses are 12, 1, 2, and 3. These are our innermost world, our subconscious, our physical body, our personal wealth, our private thoughts. And because, again, their ascendants are the same, they're off by 2 degrees, all of these planets fall in the same personal houses of the other person's chart. So there's a powerful personal impact. We have these two self-absorbed people who powerfully impact one another. This is where part of the magic of that relationship is. But I was pointing out, his Jupiter falls in her 12th house, which tends to make one feel more secure. Her Saturn falls in his 12th house. So chances are, if she was having anxiety, he knew it. He wouldn't be able to get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
If she was fussing, fretting, worrying, spinning out of control on something.
Could he maybe stabilize her in a sense?
Yes. And she could destabilize him.
Oh, no, it's to lighten up.
The other thing we want to look at, we've determined that there's all of this connection in this part of their charts. Okay, she has Jupiter at 7 Gemini. It falls in his 5th house of love affairs. He has Pluto at 12 Cancer. It falls in her 7th house of marriage, and his Pluto falls in her 7th house of partnership. So there is that intense connection. Now, his Neptune 21 Leo falls in her 8th house, and her Neptune falls in his 8th house, which could certainly be a shared intuitive exchange. Parallels are whenever there are planets within the same degree of declination. So, if we started with his sun or her sun, 8 degrees south, we're going to look for any planets in his chart that might fall close to that, which would be 8 degrees south or 8 degrees north. The closest thing here is Mars, which is 9 north, but it looks like they're 6 minutes out of orb of parallel.
We're just looking at natals.
Natals,
Yeah.
right. Again, we're going to look at the aspects. We're going to finish up tonight by looking at the aspects between their charts. This is one aspect that I cannot show you in... You all have this sheet. What is shown on this sheet are what I call hard aspects. Those are aspects by zodiacal longitude. Parallels are different because they're determined by declination. So, no aspect between the sun. All right, moon, 17 south. We're going to look for anything at
There's nothing there.
17 north or 17 south. There is an 18. So 1742
There's still
to
a bit.
1846 is 4
It's out.
minutes out. All right, let's go down to 17 south. Oh, we've already determined. 7 south.
Nothing there.
Yeah, this is hard to follow because it's the first time we're doing it. 21. Anything here at, let's see, 21 7 and 2048 falls within a parallel. This is Pluto to Jupiter is parallel.
Is there a parallel?
Yes, that's called a contraparallel, though they tend to work pretty much the same way, which is, and here we can see the ascendants are parallel. So, parallel aspects are so hard to define. The way I like to define them is it is like the volume control on your amplifier. If I crank this up and you speak, the sound becomes that much louder. And so what I have found, and here, we found only 3 parallels between these charts. Sometimes you'll have a chart where there may be 10 parallels taking place. And oftentimes that will create a relationship between people where you can't really define what it is that draws them to one another. But there are very, these intense, underlying affinities or attractions that sometimes lack clear definition. The clear definition that we can get when we look at planets in aspect. So, moon at 1 degree Pisces is forming what relationship to Neptune at 2 degrees Virgo?
An opposition.
And how do oppositions express between people?
Sometimes as a tug of war or bringing two opposites together.
The tendency of the opposition is to first attract and then repel.
In a real world scenario, if you were to talk about how would Moon in Pisces opposing Neptune in Virgo, because you got, Neptune, the ruler of Pisces, the moon, and then Neptune in a sign that's opposing itself, that wants to discriminate, and Neptune wants to unify. How would you bring that to, what would you say about that?
Well, I would say the domestic urges are in a separation compound with the utopian urges. And what we would want to look at is what areas of their chart that's taking place. For him, it's in his 2nd house of finance. For her, it's in the 2nd house of other people's, the 8th house of other people's money. So their disillusionment or disappointments might have to do over personal and joint resources. Oh, honey,
House's apartment money.
I just bought a $120,000 race car. Isn't that exciting? Oh dear, I had hoped to have that money for our children's education. It might work that way, Holly. Or there could be details that we don't know about. We're not always privy to the details of other people's financial lives. We can certainly have access to their tax records, but that's about it. But let's go back and look for another aspect. One of the other things I'd like to say, when the Moon and Neptune are in opposition, there is obviously an intuitive, emotional connection between people that is both compelling and repelling. And again, the advantage of something like this between charts, you may have had the experience of being around couples where they're talking and one person will fill in the sentence for the other person. Or you might have a friend where you might think something, you might think black olives, and they'll say something like, oh, I saw cans of olives on sale at the supermarket yesterday. Where you just have this sort of link, this Vulcan mind meld that happens. What's the disadvantage of such a thing? The disadvantage of too great compassion or empathy is when somebody else is suffering.
Being like a psychic sponge and absorbing the suffering of another.
Right, or the distress of the other, or the upset of the other, whatever level it is. All right, Sun, 6 degrees Aquarius, Jupiter, 7 degrees Gemini. What do we have?
Nice trine.
We have a nice trine. Jupiter tends to bring buoyance to any relationship. What might Joanne be able to do for Paul's ego?
Make him laugh, light him up.
She could light him up. She could be generous with her praise and make him feel good about one another. Who amongst us does not like people that do that for us? So, and what could he do? His Sun trines her Jupiter.
He can just shine and she has fun.
Right. She could bask in his light. Get a suntan. Well, that Jupiter is also involved in an inconjunct to both his Jupiter and his midheaven. So she could also expand him in terms of things regarding his faith or business life. In this case, their charitability. I think Paul Newman came from a Jewish family and she from a Southern Christian family, so they would not have shared the same faith, but there could have been between this inconjunct between Jupiter, they could probably find what they had in common.
Is there generosity?
Is there generosity of spirit, that's philanthropy that they engaged in. Now, Sun in Pisces, 8 degrees, midheaven in Scorpio, 8 degrees. What's going on here? It's a trine. So she could also be his best PR person. With his midheaven trining her Sun, they could work together. He also directed sometimes. And it's a sextile from Jupiter in Capricorn to the Sun in Pisces. What is the advantage of having Jupiter relationships between charts?
They would serve to expand each other and be of benefit.
Yes, but the really simple answer is you laugh. People that you get to laugh with, you end up liking. Now, Jupiter, 8 degrees Capricorn, Saturn, 9 degrees Capricorn. What is that aspect? A conjunction between business planets. I always like to place importance on the conjunctions between charts because these are truly the points of soul contact. And again, when we looked at the number of films they did together, their business was united both in philanthropy and in film. Now here's a problem. Uranus, 9 degrees Aries, to Jupiter, 8 degrees Capricorn. What is that aspect? 2 planets in movable or cardinal signs.
Square.
Right, they could. Planets in cardinal signs can only be in opposition or square. Squares are the obstacles in our lives. And let's look at what houses are being affected here to see if we can't determine what this may have been. Her Uranus, 9 Aries. His Jupiter, 8 Capricorn. Well, that's 3rd to 12th house conflicts. There may have been times where he really, really, really wanted to be alone. And she may have compulsively felt the need to talk about the new elements of her day. Or she might have had a bright new idea, which he could then run with, and then it's no longer her idea. The brainstorm might feel like, somebody stealing the ball and running with it. So that's sort of how that could express. All right. Ascendant Capricorn, 11. Pluto, Cancer, 12. What is the nature of this aspect? Opposition. Paul's Pluto, her ascendant. Let's look at that because this is a key aspect.
She was abandoned by her work from time to time.
That's a good interpretation. And how would he feel? That he might feel concerns. Okay, if I'm working, is that going to pull me away from her? Mm-hmm. And one of the ways they resolved that was working, Pluto being collaborative. In this case, an opposition was made into something unifying. What happens in charts like this, where you have oppositions, which we've seen too already, you just decide to write it out, that you're going to work through those differences. When you have that dynamic within yourself, you do have a greater ability to recognize that in a relationship and be more embracing of that. Here's an interesting aspect. Pluto, 12 Cancer, Venus, 13 Pisces. What is that aspect?
Trine.
A trine. So, aspects from Pluto to Venus can make one feel like this is destined in some way. This is my cosmic mission, to love this person. Venus is also going to sextile the ascendant. We spoke last week of trines or sextiles between Saturn and Venus as being indicative of long-term relationships, because Saturn's the tent peg that holds that kite in place. And then there is a sextile to Mercury. So her Venus, which is her dominant harmony, functions to stimulate him favorably and vice versa. He is stimulating her favorably. He's bringing out the best in her. His Venus at 14 Capricorn sextiles Venus at 13 Pisces. So you've got a perfect combination, even though we've got these oppositions. Moon, Neptune, and Pluto ascendant. There's enough to break up over between those. But you've got this incredible love force going on to where you can't think of that other person not being in your life because they're such a source of pleasure to you. And then Mercury is semi-sextile Mercury, 13 to 14 degrees, one sign apart. Again, that makes for an ability to have ease in communication. Mercury, semi-sextile Venus. Again, stimulating, the sound of her voice could make him feel love. There is only one other aspect, which is a sextile from his Mars to her moon. So, there we have it. In conclusion, no, there's not perfect aspects between these charts, but there is an incredible physical connection. There is an incredible love, affection connection between the two of them. There is a business and philanthropic connection. So they're connected on so many levels that to break up or to separate would require the unraveling of so much of their lives. They had 3 children together. He had 2 children by his first wife.
How long was he married to his first wife?
I think 5 years.
Oh, not very long.
And Paul Newman died of lung cancer, age 83, on September 26, 2008. And I don't have her death date here. Progress chart to September 26, 2008. Let's see if we can see anything that might represent the loss of one's spouse happening at that time. Look at this, midheaven, opposition Pluto. And the moon was moving up to an opposition with Pluto. But oppositions are separations or losses. Mm-hmm. And that would definitely, that's the strong aspect that would indicate that. We might look for aspects to the Sun or to Neptune, which are the 8th house of death. Right, the moon came along 2 months later to oppose Pluto, but it was actually the midheaven is in opposition to Pluto, both natal and progressed at the time of the loss of her spouse.
Oh, okay. So I guess I'm looking at a chart. I must not be seeing.
Right. What happened? If you look, I don't know if you can see on the screen. The chart you have is progressed to the time of their marriage. What I have on the screen is the chart progressed to the time. Her chart progressed to the time of the loss of her spouse. It was just a last effort in class to see if we could note anything that might, how we might look for that in a chart. Because the thing is, the other thing about relationships, you'll hear quite often from people they don't want to get hurt. Well, guess what? You cannot engage in a relationship and not get hurt. They will either leave you or they will die or you will die first. Somebody always leaves. And so one has to go through life boldly and courageously and just be determined that you're in it until you're not. What I do want to address, though, before we close, it's now 8. The 8th house of death is ruled by the Sun. At the time of her spouse's death, the Sun at 25 Taurus was squaring her moon at 24 Aquarius. No doubt there is financial impact whenever you have the loss. But the moon also represents our domestic urges, our family. So here, in a sense, it's the loss of family taking place.
Her home situation probably changed dramatically, I would think. It'd be interesting to investigate that.
Yeah. True. At the same time, I see one's midheaven as representing their life goals. And with his loss,
reputation, how
it's-
the world sees.
right, and it's not unusual for, especially in long-term relationships, 30, 40, 50 years, when one person dies, it's not unusual for the other person to follow within a couple of years because of the loss of identity and the loss of their goal. Especially,
Yes, and a change in status from married to widow.
right.
Yeah.
I truly think the dynamics of, we'll continue to see this unfold over the next few weeks, but the dynamics of our relationships are so spelled out by the positions in charts. Next Thursday, see you then. Thank you for attending.